Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, January the 14th, 2025. It's 6 days until the inauguration, the second inauguration of Donald Trump. And the day before, he will be holding a DC rally to celebrate his victory in November. For some people, this will be a source of great celebration. For others, of outrage. And there seem to be that many people in the United States these days who are caught between those two camps of celebration and outrage. So what's dividing them, and what explains a divided America? There's an interesting new book out today by my guest, Kurt Gray, called OUTRAGED, which takes a different look at the divisions in our politics these days and our disagreements on the morality or the lack of morality on politics. Kurt Gray runs the Deepest Beliefs lab at the University, I think, of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And he also runs the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding there too. And appropriately enough, he's joining us from Chapel Hill. Kurt, will you be celebrating next Monday, the inauguration?
Well, I think I will be excited if everyone stays calm and there is no huge excitement on either side.
Well, you're not answering my question, though. I mean, will you be happy or not?
I mean, I think the inauguration is the time for us to come together. You know, I think there's a time for the kind of us versus them of the election, of being really kind of your side versus my side. And I think on the inauguration day, I'm not going to be rooting for any side because there's no other sides in a sense anymore. I mean, you can still advocate for your side, but ultimately that's a day where we have to come together and figure out, the next 4 years that we're stuck with each other.
Well, you said it, Kurt. We're stuck with each other. It sounds like an unhappy marriage where two people are stuck with each other. There'll be many people next Monday who will indeed be outraged that America should elect, at least in their mind, a sexual predator, maybe even a sexual criminal, a racist, and all the rest of it. What do you make of that? In your new book, Outraged, how would you explain the outrage that somebody like Donald Trump, and particularly Donald Trump, seems to elicit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right that so many people are so angry and so full of rage. I think ultimately what explains it is not what people typically think of. And so when you think of why someone votes for a candidate, if you're on the other side from that candidate, you think that they're terrible people who want to burn America down. But my research, and ultimately what the book's about, is how folks are trying to protect themselves and their families and their country with their voting decisions. And so if you're on the side of not voting for Donald Trump, then you are outraged because you see him as a threat to yourself, your family, the country. But if you voted for him, then you see him as helping to protect those very same things. And so there's these competing visions of who's protecting us from the harms that we fear.
I don't want to turn this, Kurt, into another conversation on Trump. I'm sure most of our audience and probably yourself are sick of it. But the way you presented it is that everyone wants to protect their country, but everyone has a different definition, especially when it comes to the current political state in America of what America actually is. Some people would deny that the hinterland between the coasts is really America. Others would suggest that New York and San Francisco, where I live, isn't really America. So isn't this notion, for example, of protecting the country just a figment of one sort of interest or another? Is that real? Are you suggesting? And you're a social psychiatrist, so you are looking at this in a scientific sense. But doesn't everyone present our country as the country that they want, that they're in favor of?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I'm a social psychologist, as you mentioned. I'm also, I grew up in Canada. And so this is my adopted home. And so it's
soon to be part of the United States, at least according to Donald Trump.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Good Tim Hortons donuts up there if if you're a fan. But I think what's really going on is we construct all sorts of things in our mind, like a country. You say, like there's a there of the country, which is a set of borders, but we kind of socially construct these things. And when it comes to morality, the same is true, right? We kind of socially construct together with our groups in our minds of what's important and what is essential to protect. And so I think when it comes to our country and when it comes to morality, we have different visions on the left and right about who is most vulnerable to harm and therefore who's worthy of protecting. And that ultimately boils down to this kind of opacity, this kind of like, it's difficult to understand who is really vulnerable to suffering. And so we have these competing visions of like, who really suffers in America today and who are we most compelled to protect?
But isn't that our own, again, self-interested version of morality? Let's take another example, which is bound to become increasingly controversial in the United States in this second Trump regime. Immigration. So I guess what would be your take on the profoundly different views on immigration from the Trumpian versus the anti-Trumpian position?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think immigration perfectly reveals this split into who we're worried about protecting and who is most vulnerable. And so if you are more progressive, then you are focused on the vulnerability of migrants coming up to the border, maybe fleeing violence in their homeland. And you're preoccupied with parents getting separated from children, the suffering caused by deportations, so forth. But if you are more on the right, then I think the harms that you're worried about are harms to citizens, perhaps losing their jobs, or citizens harmed by a story of there's a drug cartel member who comes up from Mexico and murders someone in New Jersey as part of an initiation ceremony. Now, I think it's totally fair to argue about, which statistically is more true, which poses a greater threat to America. But our minds don't really work in terms of statistics. Instead, they anchor on these kind of salient stories of harm. And so these competing visions of who we need to protect are grounded on a kind of real story of suffering, either migrants or citizens. And this clash means that when you're presented with the suffering of the other side, you're like, yeah, that's bad, but we really need to worry about this group of people. And that can make kind of seeing eye to eye challenging for sure.
But aren't you legitimizing any kind of morality in this thinking, Kurt? I mean, I don't like to do this. I've already brought up Trump, but let's do the next step and bring up Hitler and the Nazis. Wouldn't your analysis suggest that, yes, of course, the German people or some German people were outraged by what they perceived as a stab in the back by German Jews against the Germans in the First World War, or the amount of power German Jews had in the German economy, or the fact that they didn't understand the dress and the belief of German Jews, so that their outrage against the Jews was essentially, in your analysis, no more or less legitimate than any other kind of outrage. At what point does outrage get beyond morality and become simply pure evil?
Yeah, so I think there's an important distinction to be made. And certainly I'm not a fan of Hitler, right?
No, I'm guessing that, especially since you're Canadian, right?
That's right. And, my personal political convictions, obviously, I'm not in favor of handguns growing up in Canada. I think single payer healthcare is what I grew up with. I can see the strengths of that. But I also moved down to America, where I appreciate, certain additional freedoms here. And obviously I'm committed to protecting my adopted country. But I think there's folks really on each side. Like I took an Uber ride to the airport with, to your point about what is America, with a Christian.
But you're ignoring.
I'm getting the question, right? And so he, you know, we're talking about abortion, and he says, you know, like, oh, pro-choice people, like, isn't that just like Hitler? Like, aren't they murdering babies by the millions? And at that point, I had to push back and say, look, we can all agree that Hitler's bad, but I think it's a false analogy to compare like one position of half the people in America with the Nazis. So I think what I want to do is I want to separate the kind of political elites that I think we can, or many people can agree, are not great in terms of their moral character, right? I think even people who voted for Trump say that there's many things that they do not like about him and they do not respect about his kind of moral character. And yet, you know, half of America voted for him. And so I want to distinguish like elites, people who foment conflict, people who kind of incite this outrage, from the kind of half of everyday Americans who want to live their life. So I'm not an apologist for any political leader. Right?
You know, I take your point, and I'm certainly, the last thing I'm doing is accusing you of being an apologist for Hitler. I'm just suggesting that this kind of analysis that suggests that behind all political ideologies, if that's the right term, is some sort of sense of wanting to protect ourselves or our community or our perceived community, could be extended to a group like the Nazis. After all, the Nazis won whatever it was, 30% of the vote in the last free election in the Weimar Republic. So they weren't completely isolated. So again, I don't want to become fixated on the Nazis because it becomes boring and childish. But at what point in the way that you look at the world, does this notion of wanting to protect our community become what I would define as immoral? Or are you suggesting that there's no such thing as morality, that it's somehow a consequence of our innate desire to protect others or our community?
Good question. And I think there are two separate concepts. There is a kind of normative morality, which is what we should do. And there's a descriptive sense of morality, which is what people feel is the right thing to do. And as a social psychologist, I study the latter. I study how people make decisions. And I think we agree on 99% of these kind of questions about descriptive morality. But I think where we disagree, right, that's where outrage comes from. That's about competing visions of protection and harm. And I think when we need to kind of step in a sense, and kind of stand up for kind of normative morality, is where I think people's assumptions about what harms are actually being caused are wrong. And so I think this connects to things like misinformation, propaganda, right? I think if many people in the country are making decisions and expressing judgments that are not grounded in reality, I think just like Nazi Germany, right, there's lots of propaganda campaigns, then I think we need to kind of stand up stronger. But I think there are many times where there's a legitimate position on both sides of an issue, like taxes, immigration, even abortion, right? There are well-meaning people on both sides. And so I want to make sure that we don't say whoever disagrees with us on a reasonable issue is evil, even if there is a kind of a spectrum where further out, I'm absolutely happy to say that evil is evil.
You wrote an interesting op-ed for the New York Times just before Christmas of last year. You say, we've misunderstood human nature for 100 years. I'm always a bit, I mean, I know the authors don't often come up with the titles for their pieces, but do you stick by that? I mean, firstly, how have we historically defined human nature, and why have we misunderstood it?
Yeah, it was a fun op-ed to write. I got a lot of comments.
I can imagine, yeah.
In a very quick fashion. Some from vegans who were saying, great, you finally proved me right. It wasn't a pro-vegan piece, but I can see maybe why they're excited, because the point of the article was that we evolved less as predators than we think and more as prey. And so it's not a either or, but I think in the past, we've considered human beings to be much more predatory, much more aggressive, much less concerned about our vulnerability and the threats in the world than is actually the case. And so the argument I made was that when you look back in the historical record, it's easy to see things kind of recently that support our idea of like humans as hunters, humans as predators. But if you look back kind of, I think, more clear-eyed and way beyond where we typically look, which, cave people with stone-tipped spears. If you look to when we were kind of like more hominids, ancient hominids, there, we're really about protecting ourselves. We're really preyed upon, right? Frequently eaten by big cats, and less of a predator. And I think that's still within us more than we give credit for.
Who's responsible then, Kurt, for this definition of human nature? Is it Darwin and his followers?
I think in part, I think it's interesting to think about, right? Like, who writes history? Who writes scientific theories? It's scientists who have a certain worldview. And when I think about Darwin, folks like that, right? They were literally apex predators, as humans have been for a very long time, right? So Darwin shot and killed an animal from almost everywhere he visited. He ate some stew from Galapagos turtles, which I think many conservationists would shudder at today. These are folks who hunted animals from horseback, who felt really as apex predators, as hunters. And yet, if you go back further, we were not these kind of predators. And I think in the article and in the book, I kind of place the blame, if you will, on one scientist from about a century ago named Raymond Dart, who discovered a set of bones from millions of years ago, a missing link between kind of apes and humans, although there's like links all the way along. And he argued that this showed evidence of humans butchering each other, suggesting that we were cannibal killers. An uncle would eat a nephew. Turns out it was not the case. Turns out that was an eagle butchering a child. And so what he thought was evidence for cannibalistic killing, us as predators, was in fact evidence that our children were eaten by predators. So I think that's really the kind of thing that set us on the trajectory of Lord of the Flies, of Joseph Conrad, I mentioned in the book. But I think, we're really more like, oh my God, is that thing out there in the wilderness, is it going to get us? I think if you want to try it yourself, go to a forest at dusk, take off your clothes except your underwear and just stand there as night falls. When you hear sounds, I'm guessing you don't think, oh yeah, it's something I can eat and kill. You think it's something that's going to get me, And so I think we're just more prey than we think.
What about when it comes to politics? The debate you're wading into in Outraged is one that's been going on now for 400 or 500 years. Certainly, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan and his sense of a state of nature and our need for security fits into your argument. Isn't there a political dimension to this? I mean, you claim to be a social psychologist. Of course, you are in a sense, but isn't science itself in its own way biased? A lot of people are going to be listening to this and thinking to themselves, here comes another liberal social scientist claiming that we're much softer and more loving than we really are.
Yeah, so it's a great point. And as I was kind of drafting the book, obviously, Rousseau and Hobbes come up, and this competing tension of like, are we good? Are we evil? Are we kind? Are we fierce? And I think this is an orthogonal issue. I'm not saying that we're particularly soft or kind, and it's clear that we are ruthless killers when a situation, presents itself. But I think the driver of that violence, of war, things like this, is more grounded in concerns about harm and concerns about protecting ourselves than I think we often think about. Even kind of long-standing conflicts, intractable wars between nations or families is really grounded in well, you harmed me. I'm the victim here. I'm under existential threat. And so it's justified for me to harm you and do these terrible things to you, and vice versa. And so a lot of these conflicts are more grounded in concerns about threat. So I'm not saying that we're not capable of evil. I'm saying that to understand this idea of feelings of victimhood, of competitive victimhood, that's how we make sense of conflict, not that we're, better than we necessarily think we are.
But doesn't power also, Kurt, really matter here? We've done many shows. We did one a couple of weeks ago on the dismal promise of happiness for the Palestinian people in 2025. Clearly, your arguments in Outraged worked for both the Palestinian and the Israeli communities in how they think about themselves and their enemies and morality. But the reality on the ground in Israel is that the Israelis are the ones with the sophisticated weapons and the Palestinians are the ones hurling rocks. So power still matters, doesn't it?
Yes. And I think that is the kind of deep, unspoken, but as you've spoken it, the really important kind of tension between describing human nature and how our minds work and connecting that to questions of right and wrong and kind of normative morality, right? There's all our perceptions where we kind of make sense of what's right and wrong to ourselves and our social groups. And then I think there's the fact on the ground, the kind of statistical truth of who actually is being harmed, how many more people on one side or the other are being harmed. But I think, my job, and I think what I try to offer readers is a way to make sense of the other side so that you can understand where they're coming from.
But do you think, I take your point, but do you think, for example, I don't know, some 10-year-old or 12-year-old kid in Gaza has just lost his entire family because of an Israeli bomb, are going to be somehow calmed by the fact that there is a sense of outrage on the Israeli side after the events of October 2023? Does it really make any difference to understand the other side in that sense? And are people able to do that?
I think if you look at the people who have best moved past conflict, so Northern Ireland and the Troubles, the genocide in Rwanda, I mean, I think those are cases, especially Rwanda, where there's a clear power imbalance, where there's massive harms done asymmetrically. And the way that those nations, those groups have managed to move past that conflict is by understanding where people are coming from and how they're thinking about it. It doesn't make past actions right, but I think if you're being pragmatic about it, if you're trying to move past it, you're trying to address these things, it's clear that just saying that you're evil, no, you're evil, and doing the best you can to harm the other side is not what's going to get us to move past this conflict. So I think, from a pragmatic perspective, for trying to build coalitions, even in America, right? This side's evil, no, this side's evil, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if we want to achieve some common goals, kind of bend the arc of the universe towards justice, you need to get some people on your side, you need to get some allies. And to do that, I think it's not sufficient to demonize them. You have to try to figure out where people kind of more in the middle are coming from and bring them to your side. And this can help understand how to do that.
You quoted Martin Luther King in bending history towards justice, but there are people within the African American community in particular who will suggest that that there's no need for them to understand the position of what seem to be now sort of white neo-segregationalists in the South and elsewhere in America, and the sometimes overt racism of Trump and the contemporary Republican Party. Why should, again, they make any attempt to forget history, given the tragic, catastrophic history of African Americans' slavery in the United States?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that people who have suffered injustice, right, should necessarily, right, forgive. And certainly not forget. But I do think that if you want to make changes in a democracy, and I think, many folks on the left are saying, look, this is a threat to our democracy. We need to protect our democracy. I mean, this was a vote of a democracy in America, right? Re-electing Trump. And so if we're operating within a democratic system, then we need to find a way to convince people to build coalitions to affect change, whatever the kind of ultimate moral questions are. And I think they're clear to many of us, but you still need to kind of convince folks that it's important to affect change. And so from a pragmatic sense, I think it's useful to understand where people are coming from. But I also want to give an example of Daryl Davis. He is a Black blues musician who has, over the course of his time here on Earth, done an incredible thing, which is befriended over 200 more now KKK members and convinced them to hang up their robes. So here's someone who, was fully within his rights of hating those who hated him, right? Their explicit philosophy was, the destruction or subjugation of him and people who share his race. And yet he kind of reached out and sat down with coffee with them, figured out where they were coming from, ultimately understood, where their perceptions of fear or threat driven from ignorance, that hostility was driven from, a place of ultimately, I think, confusion and fear. He got to that. They hung up their robes based on his friendship. I'm not saying that everyone or many should do that or should feel compelled to do that, but it was effective. And so again, we need to separate the question of, should you have to do that? No. Did it appear to be effective at reducing the number of white supremacists? Yes. And I think that's an important lesson to think about.
Kurt, given your way of thinking about the world, or your analysis as a social psychologist, and your sense of us as not just predators, but being hunted as well, does that make you, when it comes to a political wrapping for this definition of human nature, does that make you sympathetic to the framers of the Republic, particularly Madison, who of course famously said, "We're not angels, and that we all pursue our own interests and we form naturally into faction"? Does that make your analysis sympathetic to the system of politics in America, the democratic system of balance of powers? Is that the best way to frame our differences in a political sense, so that we're not falling back into a Hobbesian civil war?
I'm not a constitutional scholar, so and I am careful not to speak kind of too much beyond my specific expertise, and that certainly is. But I do think, that being said, right, democracies around the world that are successful, I mean, not just America, I think of Canada, I think of Britain, I think of France, each of them has problems because democracies are ultimately a human system and humans are flawed. But I do think that creating a system where no one group can win absolutely, where, to go back to a previous, point, we're kind of stuck with each other in some sense, right? Where we have to compromise and we have to kind of give up winning 100% to kind of find the middle road. I think it was Jefferson who said that, we need two parties. We need a party of tradition and we need a party of progress. And when any one party kind of wins a complete runaway victory, I think that kind of absolute power tends to corrupt, as we've seen through history, Nazis, communists, whatever. And so I do think that the kind of like messiness of democracy is probably the best we've got, as we can see through history. And so I am impressed with their kind of like forward thinking, although obviously specific ways of framing the Constitution, excluding women, excluding Black people, all these things are obviously, not morally upstanding. But I do think that the general idea of kind of checks and balances makes a lot of sense.
Should we look as much inward as outwards? You said we're stuck with each other, but also we're stuck with ourselves. Many of us who are at least half honest in terms of our self-interpretation recognize that we're not perfect. And often we are perhaps outraged by some of the things we do to ourselves. So this, I like your phrase of being stuck with each other, but should we also be thinking of being stuck with ourselves in terms of making ourselves perhaps more sympathetic to others?
I think that's exactly right. I think I think this quote's in the book about the mote in your eye. You're concerned about the mote in the eye of the other person, but you're not aware of the beam in your eye. I mean, these are old phrases, right? But like, it's easy to cast blame on the other person and not see it on yourselves. And that's part of what the argument's about, right? Where when we feel like we're being victimized, and it's easy to do because our suffering is so overpowering to us when we feel harmed, it's easy to see everyone else as a villain. But if you think about it, and I try to encourage folks to think about it, we all feel victimized. We all feel, harmed. And we all do things to each other, when we're feeling victimized that feel righteous to us, but other people might think is blameworthy. And so it is, I think, we are stuck with our human nature, and we can kind of aspire to goodness. We can kind of aspire to be more angelic and less demonly. But at the end of the day, I think we're stuck with this kind of like sense of ourselves and the sense of interpreting the world that we've had for millions of years. And so if we want to be better, then we need to understand actually what we're operating with, right? It's no good to think, well, if only we were like this, then things would be amazing. I think we need to say, no, this is how we are, and how can we tweak kind of our perceptions given human nature so that we can be kinder to each other.
Kurt, do we live in particularly psychotic times? I use that term carefully since you're a social psychologist. Last month, of course, Luigi Mangione, a very well-educated, smart, telegenic young man, assassinated a senior healthcare executive in the streets of New York. And there are a lot of people sympathetic. He clearly was outraged, and I no doubt his trial will be the theater of outrage. You've written about this. You did a Q&A with the Washington Post last month on why so many people celebrated the death of Brian Thompson, the healthcare executive assassinated by Luigi Mangione. It kind of reminded me of the behavior of 19th century Russian anarchists. Is this an unusual moment in the sense that our culture seems to be producing not just multiple Luigi Mangiones, but a significant amount of people who are actually sympathetic with what he did, with his outrage and his response to outrage, which was violent?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about the kind of, are we psychotic necessarily, but I do think that there is some research, some by Keith Payne, who's a colleague of mine, studying the effects of inequality on kind of bad societal outcomes. And I think as inequality increases in societies, there is more kind of desperation, there's more risk taking, and the potential for violence is there. And I think this example, the Brian Thompson assassination, I think was really about this kind of sense of this like growth of kind of this elite class. And then there are, to talk about the kind of like the genesis of communism here. And then there's a sense of, there's people who are not being served by the system and they want change. They're not sure how to do it. And so they champion this violence. And of course, it's necessary to say violence is kind of never justifiable in this kind of pluralistic democracy. But you can certainly see from a kind of, perceptual sense from people's own kind of descriptive moral judgments, why they celebrate it, right? They feel like they're continually harmed, to go back to harm and vulnerability. And then here's someone, the CEO, who seems totally invulnerable to harm in their eyes. And so his murder kind of harms very little, but sends a signal that they are being harmed. And so I think that's how it makes sense of it. I'm not sure where we're going to go from here, if this is going to be an increasingly popular way of bringing attention to kind of causes of suffering, but I guess we'll see.
Another of your colleagues, I think he defines himself as a social psychologist as well, Jonathan Haidt, I think he teaches at NYU, has written a best-selling book suggesting that a lot of this outrage, you're not the first or the last person to comment on this, is a consequence of new media and particularly social media. What's your take on the Haidt thesis, and do you address it in Outraged?
So I addressed some of Haidt's claims, mainly his previous argument in The Righteous Mind about liberals and conservatives having different kind of moral minds, different moral foundations. I think that's not true. I think there's not good evidence for this kind of like liberals, are this way and conservatives are this way, and they'll kind of never understand each other. I think the evidence does not support that claim. In terms of social media, I think Haidt there also likes to argue before the data are all in. I think it makes for provocative arguments. I'm not sure that scientists all necessarily agree on his claims.
Well, scientists never agree on anything, Kurt, especially social scientists.
Yeah, I think scientists largely agree that Haidt is speaking before all the data are known. But I do think that there are data out there, and I've collected some of this, that shows the specific ways in which social media is really bad for us. And so, this set of studies that I have looks at kind of feelings of moral panics on social media. And basically what social media does is it provides a limitless supply of threats. This is terrible, this is terrible, this is going to hell. And then it pairs those threats with metrics of virality. And we're a social species, we're attuned to what other people are thinking about, and especially what other people are worried about. And so when we see that these threats are going viral, we panic. And then the way we try to stop those threats is by getting outraged at them to kind of, combat them in the public sphere. And then that outrage gets folks on the other side more outraged. And then, there's a runaway set of moral panics every day, every hour in social media. And so I think it is true that social media really kind of supercharges our feelings of outrage, and the algorithms themselves kind of promote this kind of outrage-inducing content. So I think there is no argument there. I think the question of social media rewiring kids' brains, I'm not sure that's true, but certainly as a parent with 2 young kids, I don't want them having a phone either. So I'm sympathetic to kind of many of Haidt's claims, but I think the claims that I'm really worried about and that are really supported by the empirical literature are about this kind of outrage on social media.
Yeah, and for some people, perhaps even Haidt, the way to find common ground is to simply, to ban social media for kids, and perhaps to strongly encourage adults not to use it. The subtitle of your book is Why We Fight About Morality in Politics. We've talked about that, Kurt. The second part is how to find common ground. So how do we find common ground in an America where in 6 days there's no common ground? There's either celebration or anger and mourning. How do we build that common ground? Or maybe the common ground is already built, we just need to find it.
It goes back, I think, a little bit to what we kind of mentioned about understanding yourself, I think, is the first way, and understanding the other side. So letting go of some misconceptions, letting go of the misconception that the other side wants to destroy you, the other side hates you. It turns out that those misconceptions are obviously wrong. That makes them misconceptions, but it's extremely exaggerated how much the other side actually hates us. They don't, right? Most people, 65% of people are part of something called the exhausted majority, and they just want to live their life, right? They just want to get things done. They want to ignore social media. They want to protect themselves and their families. They just want it all to go away, basically. And so I think keeping that in mind is really important, right? Even if politics often comes up, most people, right, you just want to get on with your life. There's so many things that people want to achieve, so many dreams and hopes they have, so many fears that are unrelated to politics. So I think first step, think that politics is not actually that important to someone, and they're not actually that much filled with as much rage as the media suggests. 2, I think when we're having conversations about politics, we go about it wrong, and I think this prevents us from finding common ground. When we ask Americans in big studies, what would make you respect someone on the other side in a conversation about politics? People say, I want the facts. If the other side gives me the facts, no editorializing, no spinning, then we can have a place of common ground from which to go from. And so in my studies, I say, great, here are the facts. And then people say, not those facts, right? Those are not the right facts. Because today we have kind of competing distant, separate media environments. The facts are not the same in each of these environments. Facts seem fake. Those are not the way to build common ground because we don't agree upon them. But where our minds work, right, we're stuck with our own minds, where they work is about stories. And when we're sitting around the campfire, we tell stories. When we're sitting around kind of Christmas dinner table, right, we tell stories. And telling stories, especially about kind of where your views come from and the kind of harms and the fears that you're worried about, it's those stories that increase common ground, that lead people to see you as rational and to respect you. Because even if I disagree with your politics, your views on guns or immigration or abortion, I can totally understand why you might believe something if you think that's essential for protecting you and your family. And so telling stories about harm are really the key to bridging divides. And we've got a lot of research that looks at that. I can talk about that, or yeah.
I mean, it sounds like the kind of thesis, Kurt, that people at the TED conference will love. But we've had a lot of people on the show talking about telling stories and its value. One of the things that's so essential, or perhaps the thing that's so essential, this is the ability to listen. Anyone can tell a story. It's much more challenging to listen. So how much of your book, Outraged, is dedicated to teaching people not so much how to tell stories? We're all very good at telling stories, but learning how to listen.
There's definitely some of it in there. I mean, it's a big arc to go from the genesis of human nature to the structure of our moral mind to, how to bridge these divides. But I think, this part about finding common ground and bridging divides, as you mentioned, is really about telling, but also listening to stories. And there are ways to make people understand that they are heard and they are listened to and that you're connecting as a person. And I think at the end of the day, like I'm a kind of optimist. Obviously, I wrote this book, and I like to kind of remind myself that everyone's a human being at the end of the day. And so finding ways to connect with people's humanity and to move past the kind of are you red, are you blue, that is so polarizing today. I think that's the key, right? Just connecting with each other on a human scale. And so you can do that by listening, as you mentioned. And I think a very powerful way that folks who are watching can do that is by asking questions before you kind of jump to the kind of argument, right? So in the book, I talk about 3 things for kind of like having these better conversations. It's CIV, spells the beginning of civil conversations, a little cutesy, but C is connect. So before you talk about politics, you connect with someone as a person, and particularly you ask them questions. What hopes do you have for this upcoming year? What are you afraid of? When was the last time you cried? Who is your first love? I mean, these questions you think are like crazy to ask a stranger on a train.
I mean, anyone who asks me the last time I cry, especially a stranger, I'd smack them in the face.
Right, that's what you think, right? That's what you think. But there's a study by Nicholas Eppley at the University of Chicago, and he randomly assigns people to have these kind of powerful conversations on the train into Chicago. And at the end of these conversations, people, you have to work your way up to it, it's open with that. But people report feeling much more understood, right? Having much more kind of close
right.
connection.
And so that comes back to maybe not so much listening, but we all want to be heard, which is, of course, the foundations of social media. That's why we all have our Facebook and X and Instagram accounts, so that we're heard, we're seen. It's Francis Fukuyama wrote a book back in the 1990s called Trust, where he focused on this. Finally, Kurt, it's an important message you make. You're certainly not the first or the last to be making it, although you're doing it in, I think, a compelling and socially scientific, legitimately social scientific sense. What do you make of, say, the work of somebody like Arlie Hochschild, who's been on this show several times, a personal friend of mine, and in groups like the Braver Angels, who seem to be, I'm sure you're familiar with them, who are designed to, I guess, tell stories across political divides? Are there particular organizations and thinkers who you think are beginning to address the issues that you discuss in Outraged?
Certainly. There are many groups, and I have the utmost respect for those folks. I'm in part of a collaborative called the New Pluralists, and they are an organization from the left to the right of funders, a big umbrella organization with folks who are kind of committed to making sure America remains pluralistic and full of respectful dialogue. And the Braver Angels are one group who's part of that. They are a fantastic organization. They've really scaled up a lot of these insights that kind of other folks have focused on as well. I work with one organization called Essential Partners. They're in Boston, and they're kind of pioneers in this space, looking at how people across really powerful divides. I think they started after a shooting in an abortion clinic. Violence is nothing new, sadly, in America about politics. Kind of how to bring communities back together after kind of like, really devastating events. There's also Narrative 4, an organization I work with, and what they do is they have people tell stories to each other, and then they don't just listen, but they repeat back the other person's story from the first person. So if you told me a story, if you didn't hit me on the way to downtown Chicago, we're telling these powerful stories about our lives. I would tell your story as if it happened to me using I instead of you, and work shows there really powerful transformative effects on empathy. So there's lots of organizations doing this and doing a great job.
The more I listen to this, Kurt, I don't necessarily mean this critically or sympathetically. It seems as if you're turning America into a giant therapeutic exercise, in that you use the word empathy as another of these words that often come up in these kinds of discussions. Some people might think that's a critique. I'm not so sure, given the way in which, in particular, young people in America these days are so comfortable with having a therapist. Do you think this might be a way of thinking beyond politics in America today, of using the language of therapy? Certainly, Arlie Hochschild acknowledges this. She's been very influenced by her brother, who was a therapist. Could we use this language, or is it perhaps not coincidental that more and more people are going to therapy, and thinkers like yourself are calling for a more therapeutic approach to politics?
I'm not sure I'm necessarily calling for more kind of therapeutics. I mean, I'm a social psychologist, but not the helping kind. I like to tell people. I'm not sure how to make their kind of personal problems better, but I do think there is, when you understand how our minds work and how social processes work, there is a way that you can make kind of conversations better. There is a way that you can reduce your outrage. And so what I'm saying is, whether you are kind of into a kind of like more, let's give our therapy approach, or more of I'm going to go out on my own and just kind of think through my problems and do the best I can by myself. No matter what your perspective, I think understanding kind of hardware of your mind, how we evolved and how the human mind works when it comes to bridging divides, it's important. And it's important for effectively kind of lowering the dial in our lives and in our society when it comes to politics and morality.
Well, Kurt Gray, the author of Outraged, you've calmed me down. I was ready to kill someone before this conversation. Now I'm much more willing to listen to their story. An important new book and a really important new subject. Many people, particularly I think people outraged by Donald Trump's imminent inauguration, should read the book. It's out today. Congratulations, Kurt. And I hope you have a wonderfully peaceful and happy 2025 in America today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Step on the scene, I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene, yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He is the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew Keene, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.